am the author of the Malfunction Trilogy and the Raven Tree Society, and I'm here today with Robert Shultz. It's been a while since I've done anything on my YouTube channel, but I was really excited for a chance to get Robert Shultz on. He just released a book called Deadwood, which is the second in his Crockett and Crane series. So I'm going to go ahead and let Kyle introduce himself to you guys.
Okay. Hi there, I'm Robert Shultz. I write fantasy stories in a parallel universe called the Afterverse, where pretty much every fairy tale, legend, classic story in existence is real and part of history, and they've all kind of come together to form a modern world that's not very different from our own in many ways, but of course different in others because magic and monsters are real. So I write currently 2 series that are interconnected in that world, Beaumont and Beasley, which is set in a version of 1920s England, and Crockett and Crane, which is set in the Old West.
Yes, and they're excellent. So we're having some connection issues. They're not too bad, so
yeah,
I'm gonna go keep trucking through, and hopefully it'll work out fine.
Okay.
So yes, we're going to keep going. So yeah, I actually just finished reading Deadwood, and I love the Crockett and Crane series. I think, I love all of your writing that I've read so far, but I have kind of a special connection to Crockett and Crane. I think it's probably my background with horses and with Western. So yeah, I just wanted to give you a chance to kind of explain Crockett and Crane a little bit, because it's really unique.
Thanks. Yeah, Crockett and Crane started out as a serial that I was publishing on Wattpad, which I mainly did because I wasn't sure if it was going to find an audience. And it's mashing up fantasy and westerns, which there really should be a genre name for that. There's Weird West, but I feel like Weird West is kind of broad and includes science fiction in addition to fantasy, and I'm specifically doing fantasy. There are some minor sci-fi themes mixed in, like time travel and stuff, but it's mostly fantasy. And I had already mixed together fantasy with sort of a PG Woodhouse world in Beaumont and Beasley, and that's pretty much urban fantasy. It fits pretty well into the urban fantasy category, but I wanted to try doing something for Crockett and Crane since before I published Beaumont and Beasley, but I went with Beaumont and Beasley because I figured it was more marketable. But since that was popular, I thought, well, it would be fun to build on this and in the same world explore what the American West would be like. So I found a way to fit them together in the same universe without them encroaching on each other too much. And then I created these characters that the creation of the characters kind of happened in tandem with writing this draft on Wattpad, which was a really interesting experience because people got invested in the characters there, and I kind of fell in love with the characters along with everybody else. So it was a neat experience, and I became really invested in writing this series and these characters, and that was what inspired me to keep going. So currently they're not on Wattpad anymore, but I have very fond memories of starting out the project there, and I would go back to Wattpad someday with something else in future, because that was a really wonderful experience.
Yeah, I actually started out on Wattpad myself, and yeah, it was really enjoyable. I kind of quit working on it because it's such a process to keep it up. It is a social media. But yeah, I read Horseman on Wattpad, which is the first one in the series. And then I was really excited to get a hold of Deadwood, though I didn't get to read that one when it first came out. So don't you have another one in the series that's coming out as well?
Yes, and I should have even said what the series is about. I forgot to do a synopsis, but it's in short, it's about a centaur outlaw and a magic-wielding U.S. Marshal who team up together to hunt monsters. And that's my fans will probably be shouting at me, that's way too simplistic, and I didn't even mention the most popular characters, but I'm boiling it down. So that's the core of it. And yes, I am working on book 3. Books 1 and 2 kind of included elements of many different stories. Book 1 focused on Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Book two is kind of interesting. I'll talk more about how that came about under a different question that we're going to go over, but it's basically the concept that you see in so many Western TV shows and movies of a small town where things are not going well and building that into a fantasy story. And it's probably I would say it's the most original thing I've ever written, even though it does adapt certain elements of folklore. I kind of went totally in the direction of just writing something that was more out of my own head than anything else that I'd done before, which is kind of a scary experience, but it paid off, I feel, because people seem to have responded well. And book three is Westenra, which the readers of the original novel of Dracula will recognize that as the name of one of the characters in there. And that is partly tying up plot threads that were introduced in Horsemen and partly a sequel to the original novel of Dracula, because I'm a fan of the book. I think it was a really interesting book. So it's going to kind of do both at the same time.
Which it's funny because actually I think we have a similar taste in a lot of those kind of books, but Dracula is one of the original Gothic horrors that I don't particularly like. I like the ideas in them, so I'm excited to see how you're like spinning off of those. But the actual book itself is probably my least favorite Gothic horror that I've read so far. So it'll be interesting. I'm excited.
There are things in it that are like, that don't work. Like I remember one YouTuber I watched commented on the fact that the character of Quincy proves that Bram Stoker never met an American in his life, which is hilarious. And I kind of, without spoiling anything, I do kind of deal with that in the book. So I'm looking forward to spinning off of that and doing some different stuff with it. I have some interesting ideas in mind.
Yeah, which for anyone who's actually read this series, there are vampires that have poked in here and there. So I have been excited to see where you're going with that. Vampires, they're not my favorite monster trope, but I've seen them done really well a few times, and I have absolute trust in your skills as an author, so I'm excited to see how you're going to help that along a little bit. So yeah, I'm excited for that.
Sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, you go.
Well, no, I just wanted to say I like what you said there about vampires. They're not one of my favorite monsters either. In fact, I was never eager to write about them. And then I just kind of felt like, okay, well, vampires and werewolves would fit into this world very well, this part of the world, but how can I do them differently? So, of course, readers of Horsemen will know that werewolves, although they're not called that, do play a role in the story, and I kind of put a different twist on how they work. And vampires is going to be explored in a couple of projects. I have a prequel to the Crockett and Crane series in the works called The Good, the Bad, and the Wicked that is actually going to explore further how vampirism works in this world, which is very different from what you might expect in terms of exploring the effect that it has on other creatures besides humans. And that's also something that's going to be explored in Westenra. So I'm looking forward to that, to sort of bringing
I kind of cut out there towards the end.
I'm just saying I'm interested in bringing something new to the concept of vampires, sort of taking on that as a challenge, basically.
Yeah, so on that note, these books are very complex, all of them, whether we're talking about Beaumont and Beasley or the Crockett and Crane series. So I'm just kind of curious, especially you weave in so many different stories, mythology. We have, you mentioned classic books. We have, especially in Crockett and Crane, it deals a lot more with kind of like Western mythology and lore. And then the books themselves are plot-wise and character-wise are quite complex with a lot of twists and turns. So I'm kind of wondering how that works out. Do you do a lot of planning, or is a lot of this in rewrites, or do you just kind of wing it and see where it goes?
Well, yeah, with both Horsemen and Deadwood, since they were both written on Wattpad, basically I had an outline for each, and I didn't deviate from it too much. It was less that I changed the outline and more that stuff grew from the outline. So,
Yeah.
But I do, I mean, I like discovery writing, and I do kind of a mixture of both, I would say, discovery writing and outlining. And I do a lot of outlining because I want to contain all of my stories into a single coherent reality, because I think that element, my readers have come to expect that, and it's something that I think works well and is fun. It's what's fun about the Marvel Cinematic Universe, is kind of seeing what are the different Easter eggs that connect the different stories. So I enjoy doing that. I always have loved that kind of concept even before I became a Marvel fan. And so I don't want there to be big continuity issues. And as readers of the series will know, there are links between characters in Crockett and Crane and Beaumont and Beasley. So I like to have that be contiguous. And I also, when it comes to research, I like to address, if possible, the more obscure or overlooked elements of folklore in addition to the more famous stuff. So, I'll do a lot of research on American folklore and legends and stuff. And sometimes my sources come from pretty far afield. Like, for example, I was talking about the werewolves earlier. The name I use for them is wolver, which is actually a very localized term for werewolf from Scotland that isn't like very widespread. So, and I kind of deviated from their version in many ways, but that was part of trying to bring something new to it. And there's a couple of mentions of different things in the books that people will see, like Paul Bunyan is referenced sort of obliquely in book 1. And I even want to get into some Canadian stuff actually in book 5. I'm planning for that to be set entirely in Secordia, which is the Afterverse version of Canada, Afterverse being the name of this whole reality I'm building with here. So, and I have a fair number of readers in Canada, and they kind of asked for this in a way, and they were interested in finding out more about that. So I thought, well, there's never really been like a fantasy novel set in Canada, so I thought it would be fun to play with that. And there is a lot of history and legends to work with there, so I'm looking forward to that. That's going to be fun. Yeah.
Yeah. There's you have some kind of darker, scarier stuff in the Crockett and Crane stories. It'll be interesting to see. I can think of a few off the top of my head, kind of scarier Canadian lore. So that could be really fun. Yeah. So what does your kind of research look like when you're kind of looking for these stories? Like, what does your average research look like? Where do you get your inspiration from?
Well, I basically, like, when I'm on Amazon and I get their emails with book bargains, every time I see a collection of fairy tales or something that's for sale, I'll collect it, and I'll look through it and see if I find the inspiration in there. And I do use Wikipedia a lot, but of course I do check my sources to make sure that I'm not I'm getting it right. But actually, there are some very useful lists on Wikipedia, like their list of when they have a list of legendary creatures by type, which is very helpful, because sometimes if I'm looking for a particular monster for a certain scene or a certain plot element, that makes things a lot easier in terms of narrowing down what I'm looking for. So. And I also, for languages and stuff, I end up bookmarking things from all across the internet, like really obscure articles or things that I can go back to later. And of course, I'm always keeping my eyes open for stuff. So even if I'm researching something completely different and a possible idea crops up, I'll file it away. And I try to do a fair amount of reading of original source material, like for example the book of Dracula, and also YouTube has a lot of helpful stuff. One site that I have recommended a couple of times before is Shadiversity, and he's an Australian guy who does all kind of videos on realism and fantasy, combat, creatures, magic, kind of cool stuff like that. So that, watching those often gives me ideas, and it gave me a couple of ideas specifically for horsemen. So that's another YouTube is another place where I go to find different bits of research.
Yeah, I've been watching that channel for a good long time too. I really love his videos on castles, and he actually just self-published a novel recently. So that's exciting.
About that. I haven't read that yet, but yeah, I've heard about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cover looks amazing.
Yeah, he
Yeah.
did his due diligence there, which is
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah.
So
And he
yeah, back to
self-published
your
it, so that's
books.
pretty exciting.
It is,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love seeing new self-publishers come in and put their work in, which is really exciting. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, so as far as research goes, do you tend to have the story before you write about before you kind of bring in myths and legends, or do you tend to start with kind of one or two like myths that you want to highlight?
It varies a lot. It's so far like the two books have been very different in that sense that I've done so far. I mean, with book three, I knew I wanted to build on certain vampire-related plot elements that were in books one and two. So I went by sorry about that. That was my phone. I went by starting with Dracula as a framework and
Mm-hmm.
then building on that. So that's how that planning process is going. I have that fully outlined in detail, and now I'm just sort of getting down to the actual writing part of it. But
Yeah.
Horseman and Deadwood were very different in that sense because Horseman, I started out with wanting to write a Western with a centaur main character because I just thought it was a cool idea.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also thought, well, Legend of Sleepy Hollow is this big element in American folklore, so maybe there's some way I can connect the two. And so, yeah, so that was I had started with the initial concept of just a fantasy Western and then wove Legend of Sleepy Hollow into it as this historical event that preceded it. Um,
Yeah.
Deadwood was a little bit weirder in that when I first started planning Deadwood, my intention was actually to do something where uh, I used the actual historical and real world Deadwood, which of course that is an actual place. I was thinking, okay, I'm going to take
Mm-hmm.
Deadwood with different figures from American history that were there, different like outlaws and things, and adapt them into this fantasy Western reality that I've created here. And I still would like to do something like that, thinking of doing something like that maybe for book four, but that's not actually the direction I ended up taking with it. For some reason, I just ended up fixating on the name Deadwood. And then I was inspired with this idea of tying that in, and this is not really a spoiler because I've talked about it in the marketing, but it is connected to the story of Pinocchio. And it ended up being more about, okay, suppose that this is a version of America that is rooted in European folklore ultimately, because the people that are here in this version of and I had this idea of the ship, one of Christopher Columbus's ships being possessed by this magical entity that was originally Pinocchio. And that was such a cool concept that became the prologue. And then I ended up coming up with an outline for the rest of the book based on that. So that was a sort of a very organic, very off the cuff process. I came up with the whole plot outline for that in a day and started
Yeah.
serial based on that. So that was like a very rapid fire way that this story came into being. So that was unusual. Normally it doesn't happen that way for me, but I like how it turned out with sort of the name Deadwood taking on a specific meaning. I like that the
Yeah.
title had that much significance instead of it just being about the history, even though I do still want to do more with Western history in the future.
Yeah, which is exciting to a history buff like me. But I do find it interesting that you brought up the ship and that you're talking about Dracula as kind of the inspiration for the next book, because probably my favorite scene in Dracula, and honestly, like I would have much preferred an entire book around, is the scene where Dracula comes to England on a ship and kind of is haunting the crew the whole time through, and that's
Yes.
for me the most chilling and exciting part of the entire book. And I remember
Hmm.
reading that first section and immediately thinking back to that part of Dracula and getting all excited when I first opened your book up. So I find it interesting that that kind of
Thanks.
intersects there.
I
But
love
yeah,
that
that's pretty
part
cool.
too. That's definitely my favorite part of the book, and I wish it was more than just one chapter. Absolutely, it could have been in book 3 because of sort of the going back and forth, because obviously I have to connect Neverica, which is the American version in my book, with Europe. So I think I will be touching on that to some degree. Ships are going to definitely play a role.
Yeah, and I lost you a little bit there, but I think we can all kind of infer what you're talking about.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
That's
I think it's my camera. It's glitching.
Which is fine. The audio has been pretty good so far, and that's the important part is to hear all the wonderful.
I keep getting frozen, making stupid faces. So hopefully.
That's silly. Okay. It'll make the video more entertaining. Yeah. So these books are, speaking of entertaining, are quite humorous, and all of your books have a lot of humor in their voice. But I think I mentioned it earlier that the Crockett and Crane, more so than at least the books that I've read so far of Beaumont and Beasley, are a little bit on the creepier side. A little bit more, monsters and ghouls are a little bit more threatening, even though there are hints of it in the Beaumont and Beasley, speaking particularly in the first book of that mirror scene.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to me how well you balance those. And I'm wondering how you were able to find that balance. Was that something you had to work really hard on? Did it come naturally?
Well, I think really, I would say that what taught me how to, and also listening to a lot of Doctor Who, because I feel like Doctor Who does that very well most of the time, balancing the two. Is that I've always enjoyed about that franchise is the ability to have both of those elements going on and sort of have a good balance between them. And I think that and it also, I mean, I've been blessed with a lot of very funny people.
I'm losing you again. Can't hear you. Okay. I hear something. There we are.
Let me see if
I hear myself.
Oh, okay. How's that? Do you hear me now?
That's good. Yes, that's
okay.
Great. Excellent.
I unplugged and replugged the microphone. We're just having all kind of problems.
Okay.
Okay. So I think I was saying, yeah, I have a lot of experience with humor because I have been blessed with knowing a lot of funny people. So and I love humor. I love well done humor, and I have never had much difficulty making people laugh usually. So I think that I think I've always had a hard time writing pure comedy. I think the one story I wrote, The Hound of Duville, which is part of book 4 of Beaumont and Beasley, is the most pure comedy thing I've ever written. And even that has some darker moments because I just couldn't help myself. But
yeah. Oh no, lost you again.
Okay.
There you are.
I always had a hard time writing comedy because I want there to be enough tension that I'm sort of nervous about what's going to happen to the characters. I want there to be something to invest emotionally in. So
yeah.
Depressing. I don't think it would be my nature to write that. So I kind of have to have both in the same book in order to feel motivated to finish the story and to make it happen, basically. So those are, I enjoy writing those, I think, as hopefully as much as people enjoy reading them, and it kind of all works in tandem, basically. So it comes pretty naturally for me, ultimately.
Okay. Yeah. Well, we're still having some technical difficulties, so I'm going to go ahead and we'll ask 2 more questions and then probably cut it a little bit short. We're probably running over anyways because...
Yeah, I think we are. I've been talking too long. I've been talking too much.
No, it's great. That's the whole point of this. I just wish I could hear all of it.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, so I think the one I think it's I've worked with horror and humor a little bit with the Raventree Society series that I have.
And it's
Although
awesome.
mine is pretty much flipped reverse, where yours is more humor than horror. Mine is definitely more horror than humor. But I found that they're both of them are very hard to write, and because they're very hard to fake. Because humor, either laugh or you don't, and it's that split second. And as far as like fear, you can't help what you're afraid of. So have you found that something difficult to balance, and how do you feel your readers respond to that balance?
Well, I think that much of my work is based on very old archetypal stories of one kind or another, and all of you're dealing with stories that are based on or inspired by fear in some fashion. Like, any story that involves wolves is connected to fear of wolves. Some of the stories about wicked stepmothers are fear of abandonment, so on and so forth. And many people and that is an important part of those stories. So I don't feel like I want to ignore that completely. Many people who adapt those stories, especially in this day and age, tend to go the pure horror route because, and they'll say that's because they feel that's truer to the story. But I'm not saying that that's completely wrong, but for my own purposes, I don't adopt that perspective with my writing because I don't have a problem really with, for example, Disney's more hopeful, upbeat take on the story. Happy ending. I don't really see any need to have it be depressing. I know some people really take issue with that, but it's not something that I'm with, because I think it's sort of that balance we're talking about. You have the evil, and then you also have it all builds toward a happy ending. So in my stories, I like to acknowledge and embrace the fear that drives the main conflicts of these old stories, and that it makes
I think I'm missing out like a lot here. Can't hear you. I know you're saying something important because you're laughing. Can you hear me? You can hear me? Okay, I can't hear you. Okay, so. Okay.
hang on.
I got you. I hear you.
Can you hear me? Okay. All right.
Yes.
I just
gotta hold on a
plug
few
my
more
microphone.
minutes.
I don't know why that is. Okay. All right. So, hang on. I lost my note. Okay. So I'm saying that, yeah. So I don't try to ignore the scary stuff in the old stories. Sometimes I kick it up several notches, which is what happened with Pinocchio, obviously. And I don't really regret that, because that is a creepy story. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna
Yes.
about that story. It is creepy. But I also emphasize hope, because I strongly agree with what Tolkien said about the necessity of happy endings and how sort of the core of Christianity.
Oh, there you are.
I think that Tolkien was right about happy endings being important.
Yeah.
So, but I also, so despite that, though, I do think that the fear is important along the way to that hopeful conclusion, because within reason, most people seem to like being scared. And I do enjoy doing that without going overboard and piling on violence that would be more gratuitous and depressing my readers, because and I also do think that mainstream critics complain about things being scary way more than they used to, which isn't always a good thing, because then you end up with boring stories. So I'm just trying to keep the reader's interest and give them a fun, escapist experience, but without going overboard, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that you make an important point kind of about how hope um, and happy endings are important, but so are those kind of darker places because I think, you know, this old saying is shadows prove the sunshine.
Yeah.
And it really
Yeah.
kind of shows, you know, if you're laughing one moment and then you turn around and you're, you know, terrified because Pinocchio's coming to get you. I think that makes that much more effective when, you know, when you have that kind of hope come back. So I definitely think that was balanced very well, especially in Deadwood, because yes, very, very creepy puppet monster.
Yeah. And he did a lot of stuff in that book. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll kind of go on to the final question and kind of wrap this up before the freezing gets any worse. So a lot of authors kind of divide along the lines of whether a story should be purely entertaining or whether a story should be realistic or if it should sort of teach a lesson. So a lot of your stories feel like pure entertainment, but I was kind of wondering where you kind of sat on that, whether you prefer to write stories that you're just looking to entertain your readers or whether you have themes that you work into those.
Yeah, I personally never start with a message or a theme, mainly
Mm-hmm.
because every time I've tried, it hasn't worked.
Yeah.
I just can't write a good story that way. I'm not saying that no one can, but I think that objectively it's important for all writers to remember that the values and beliefs that we consider most important will naturally make their way into the story we write, whether we intend for that to happen or not.
Yeah.
So basically, as I'm writing, whenever a message does creep in, I leave it there, basically. I think Deadwood is probably the furthest I've gone in so far in including
Yeah.
themes of faith. There's been a little of that in other books. In the Janus Elixir, which is also part of Beaumont and Beasley 4, there's some exploration of the ancient past of the Afterverse that kind of gets into the Christian worldview. That's really the only other place I've done it so far. And some of the
Mm-hmm.
Christian elements in Deadwood will carry over into Beaumont and Beasley Book 3. And that book will also contain hints to an issue that I do feel very strongly about, but it still happened very organically as I was writing, and I don't think it's going to come across as preachy. I really don't. I
Lost you there.
do this again.
Try that. We're almost there. We're gonna make it. I hear you.
Okay, all right. Yeah, it must be this headset. I don't know what to do. Maybe that's what's causing it all the glitching. I have to get a new headset.
Maybe. Well, it's an audio, and sometimes it'll freeze up otherwise.
Yeah.
We'll make it.
But anyway, yeah. There are. But anyway, in answer to your question, I I never start with the themes, but they do find their way in. I don't try deliberately to keep them out. I do think there is too much message fiction these days, so I really try to steer clear of that because I know that by and large people don't like it. Some more of like elitist people in critical circles do, but I know that most of my readers don't. So I really try to stay away from that, partly for my own beliefs on the issue and partly just because I know it wouldn't fly well. So, but I'm certainly not against or prone to not put in something that reflects upon my beliefs. I think it's important, willing to do that within reason, basically.
Yeah. And I'm quite vocal on my stance on the subject and my distaste for a lot of message fiction crossing over into propaganda.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I find with my fiction, especially when writing something like horror humor, when I go back and I read it, I really see that even if I'm trying to keep my own thoughts out of it, just like you said, that my worldviews are passing over and kind of the lessons I'm learning and the struggles and the emotions I'm going through. Which, because my writing is a little bit more dramatic than yours, probably comes across a little bit stronger. But I can definitely see, and it was in Deadwood too, there was a few points where I was really excited. Did you lose me?
No, I think you lost me because it told me that
the. Oops, sorry. I think you lost me because it told me that the thing wasn't working. But I think
Okay.
You hear me now? Okay. Sorry, I was listening.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Well, I think we're kind of at the end of this, anyways. Do you have any final thoughts you want to share before we kind of close out?
Well, basically, just I guess I'll take this opportunity to say I'm really grateful for all of the reviews and the responses that I've gotten on. My sheep are mowing in the background. They're hungry, but I'll give them in a minute. I'm really excited about the response it's gotten. I knew people were going to like it because some of them had read it on Wattpad, but it's been even more enthusiastic than I had expected. So I'm really, really grateful. So I just want to take the opportunity to say thank you for everyone who has reviewed it and promoted it, and including you. And I'm really glad that you enjoyed it.
Yeah, well, they're excellent books. I encourage anyone who's watching this, go pick them up. I actually just introduced my brother the other day at a 4th of July party. He was sitting there bored. I'm like, here, read this book. And I handed him Beaumont and Beasley. So he's all excited about it now. So yeah, it's definitely will be recommending it to continue to be recommending it. I'm very excited to see what comes out next. So I'm focusing, Kyle Robert Shultz is one of the authors in the Phoenix Fiction Writers with me. I'm focusing on Phoenix Fiction writer books for the next couple months, so I'm excited to get to the rest of Beaumont and Beasley as well, because I'm behind on those. I've been eyeing them for a while, so.
Thanks. Thanks, I appreciate it.
Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and put Kyle's links below, and we're going to close this out. And yeah. Thank you for all those who watched so far. Hopefully you got the juicy good stuff between the glitches. All right. Thanks for joining me, Kyle.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.